In the classical Mediterranean understanding of the world, Thule was a mysterious land to the far north, one that little was known of and few claimed to have visited. Locations from Estonia to Iceland have been suggested, and to this day no one is entirely clear where Thule was, or indeed if it existed at all. Our first account for Thule, and one that many, if not all, of the subsequent accounts appear to come from, comes from a man called Pytheas of Massalia. He was a Greek from the colony of Massalia, today Marseille in the south of France. Born around the middle of the 4th century BC, Pytheas was a geographer, an astronomer, and an explorer, one particularly known for his extensive voyages around Europe towards the end of the 4th century BC. He was possibly the first writer from the classical Mediterranean world to have reached the British Isles and written an account on them. Within that account, Thule appears as the furthest land Pytheas claims to have reached, somewhere beyond Britain, into the furthest north of the inhabited world. How Pytheas undertook this journey is unclear. It is possible he was travelling with his own vessel and crew, and there is some textual evidence for this, as Strabo, one of our later sources, mentions that he claims to have visited the Atlantic coast of Spain, somewhere where Massalian merchants were known to operate. However, I suspect it is more likely that he travelled through existing northern European trade networks, buying passage on boats and where required hiring local navigators. Strabo also appears to suggest that Pytheas claimed to have traversed much of Britain over land, which would be much less likely were he travelling the whole way with his own ship and crew. If it was the case that he was travelling through existing trade networks, he most probably travelled light, with only a few companions and translators. Indeed, translation may have been one of the more challenging aspects of this expedition. It is likely that Pytheas himself either had some command of Gaulish, that being the Celtic language spoken in modern-day France, or he had a translator with him, but the further north he travelled, the less mutually intelligible he would have found the local languages, and he would very likely have to rely on local translators as he came to the furthest north parts of his journey. Unfortunately, Pytheas' work, titled something like On the Ocean, is now lost to us, but it is said to contain an account of an extensive journey around the north coast of Europe. We only know about Pytheas and his work due to a small number of quotations and references in our other classical period works. It is from these later writers that we get our references to Thule, contained within works such as the Natural History of Pliny the Elder and the Geography of Strabo. To identify the location of Thule, we need to delve into our classical writers and see what they can tell us about it. But before we do this, we need to make one thing clear. We are focusing on Thule as described and supposedly visited by Pytheas. It is possible, indeed it is quite likely, that the Thule of later writers such as Tacitus may not have been the original Thule as described by Pytheas. Our first classical source, and the one that seemingly preserves the most of the account of Pytheas as it relates to Thule, comes from Strabo, in his work Geographica. Strabo was an Anatolian Greek, living towards the end of the Roman Republic and the start of the Roman Empire. In his Geographica, Strabo set out to compile an encyclopedia of all of the geographic knowledge of the world known up until his time, based on the sources he had access to, including the work of Pytheas. While Strabo is our most significant source for Pytheas, this presents us with a problem, as Strabo really doesn't seem to like Pytheas. So let's see some of the things that Strabo says about him. He asserted on the faith of that charlatan Pytheas. They have been misled by putting faith in Pytheas, who is ignorant of the countries situated along the ocean. Pytheas alone dared to forge so many lies. So, needless to say, our main source is fairly hostile to Pytheas, something that may limit the usefulness of him as a source. A further problem is that Strabo may not have been working with an original copy of Pytheas' work, instead relying on the works of other scholars, such as Polybius. With these limitations in mind, what can we still get from his work? Well, Strabo mentions Thule several times through his work, and we can gain quite a lot of what Pytheas claimed about it from his account. Probably the most clear claim about Thule, contained within the Geographica, is the following. Thule, which Pytheas says is 6 days' sail north from Britain. We do need to be a little bit careful with this claim though, because as Strabo later points out, Pytheas seems to get the distance from modern France to Britain wrong, claiming it to have taken days for that voyage, whereas it seems unlikely that that was true unless a strange route was taken. However, some of Pytheas's reported distances appear to be more accurate than Strabo allows. In fact, while Strabo criticises him for supposedly exaggerating the length of the British coastline, Pytheas instead actually seems to have underestimated it. Although, given the well-known difficulty of measuring coastlines, this is hardly surprising. While we should be careful with this figure, what would 6 days' sail translate to in the Iron Age? Well, it's hard to find good figures from this time, but using later North Sea sailing vessels from the medieval period to provide a rough upper guide, we can assume a 6-day journey would have a typical range of about 300 to about 600 kilometres under typical conditions, although this could vary significantly under different conditions. Strabo later relates a strange anecdote from Pytheas. It is likewise he who describes Thule and other neighbouring places where according to him neither earth nor water nor air exists separately, but a sort of concretion of all of these, resembling a marine sponge, in which the earth, the sea, and all things were suspended, thus forming, as it were, a link to unite the whole together. It can neither be travelled over nor sailed through. As for the substance, he affirms that he has beheld it with his own eyes. The rest he reports on the authority of others. Generally, it is thought that this account represents a distorted description of an ice sea or a slush sea, filtered through Strabo's skepticism of Pytheas. It is also possible that this could be referring to the North Sea fog, what in Scotland we might call a har, a dense fog that when combined with rain, wind and low light conditions could create a sensory experience similar to what Pytheas describes, and can make sailing particularly hazardous, especially around the Scottish Isles and the western coast of Norway. Perhaps it is more likely it could refer to both, the sensory blending of North Sea conditions combined with an icy sea. Later on, Strabo tells us this. Pytheas of Massalia affirms that the furthest country north of the British Isles is Thule, for which place he says the summer tropic and the Arctic Circle is all one. Generally, this has been interpreted to refer to the Arctic summer, where the sun does not truly set during nights, a phenomenon that if we were to take completely literally would place Thule within the Arctic Circle. He then goes on to tell us, but he records no other particulars concerning it. He does not say whether Thule is an island, or whether it continues habitable up to the point where the summer tropic becomes one with the Arctic Circle. This is interesting here, as it could potentially mean a lack of a general description of Thule contained within the work of Pytheas, and it could also imply that the later descriptions of the people of Thule were not necessarily located at truly Arctic latitudes. Our last reference from Strabo reads as follows. He appears to have reasoned correctly that the people bordering on the frozen zone would be destitute of cultivated fruits, and almost deprived of the domestic animals, that their food would consist of millet, herbs, fruits, and roots, and that where there was corn and honey, they would make drink of these, that having no bright sun, they would thresh their corn and store it in vast granaries, threshing floors being useless on account of the rain and want of sun. This here describes Thule as a developed agricultural society, as opposed to, say, a sparsely inhabited land in the far Arctic. This was a society that, according to Pytheas, seems to have been growing grain, storing it in large granaries, and making alcohol with fermented honey, a practice well known in the Celtic and Germanic parts of northern Europe in the Iron Age. Our next classical writer is Pliny the Elder, a Roman writer from the 1st century AD. He was a truly prolific writer, but out of all of his writings, only his work titled The Natural History survives to us intact. He makes far fewer references to Pytheas than Strabo does, but he is also less hostile to Pytheas, and as such may have preserved a more authentic version of his account, although he generally repeats the same elements we already have in Strabo. Pliny tells us the following. During the celestial period, as the sun approaches to the pole of the world, and his orbit is contracted, the parts of the earth that lie below him have a day of 6 months long, and a night of equal length when he is removed to the South Pole. Pytheas of Massalia informs us that this is the case in the island of Thule, which is 6 days' sail north of Britain. Again confirming that in Thule there appears to be consistent sunlight during the day at the height of summer, and again referencing that claim of Thule being located 6 days north of Britain. Pliny does say later in his account that some also claim this of the island he calls Mona, most likely modern-day Anglesey, which if taken literally is definitely incorrect. However, he doesn't claim Pytheas says this, only that some unnamed others have claimed it. He does, though, suggest a far more extreme day-night cycle than Strabo claims Pytheas supports. Taken literally, this would imply a far more extreme northern latitude than the most realistic candidates for Thule. We can be fairly sure humans, especially humans operating from Iron Age Europe, had not reached the furthest northern reaches of the Arctic at this point, where the technology of the time would have made exploration prohibitively difficult, and certainly were not inhabited by an agricultural society reachable from Scotland in 6 days. Alternatively, we could say that this is perhaps an error or a misunderstanding of his sources, as Strabo is presumably working from the same or similar sources, but does not mention the phenomenon as extreme as 6 months of summer and 6 months of winter. Later on in the account of Pliny, he tells us the following. There are writers who also make mention of some other islands, Scandia namely, Dunma, Bergos, and greater than all Nerigos, from which persons embark for Thule. At 1 day's sail from Thule is the frozen ocean, which by some is called the Cronian Sea. Nerigos here is possibly referring to an island off the west coast of Norway, although that location is also rather unclear. It is also important here, as he mentions the frozen ocean that may have been referenced in the account of Strabo, is here said to be located north of Thule, rather than at Thule itself. Now Pliny doesn't mention Pytheas as his source here, but it is entirely possible he is relying on him, or combining him with various other accounts of the north that are now entirely lost to us. From the 1st century BC, we get possibly our only direct quote from Pytheas, as recorded in the work of the Greek mathematician, astronomer and philosopher Geminus of Rhodes, who tells us the following. The barbarians showed us the place where the sun goes to rest, for it was the case that in these parts the nights were very short, and in some places 2, in others 3 hours long, so that the sun rose again a short time after it had set. In contrast to the writings of Pliny the Elder, and indeed to an extent the writings of Strabo, if this is a legitimate quote, it appears to suggest a location significantly further south, although still in the far north of Iron Age Europe, placing it on a latitude perhaps closer to central Scandinavia than the high Arctic, if we were to take it entirely literally. Another of our writers is Pomponius Mela, an Iberian Roman geographer writing in his work Chorographica. In this he gives us the following account. Thule is located near the coast of the Belgae, who are celebrated in Greek poetry and in our own. On it, because the sun rises far from where it will set, nights are necessarily brief, but all winter long they are as dark as anywhere, and in summer bright. All summer the sun moves higher in the sky at this time, and although it is not usually seen at night, the sun nevertheless illuminates adjacent places when its radiance is close by. But during the solstice there is no night, because at this time the sun is now more visible and shows not only its brilliance, but most of itself too. This again seems to be an accurate account of the astronomical phenomena at a high latitude, describing the summer midnight sun and the long journey of the sun across the sky during summer at high latitudes. However, it does vary from the account as given by, say, Pliny, in that it describes phenomena much closer to the subarctic, a latitude we might associate with southern Norway or the north of Scotland, rather than truly polar regions. Writing in the 2nd century AD, the Greco-Roman writer Claudius Ptolemy gives us a series of coordinates identifying Thule. These are famously inaccurate, both due to Ptolemy's errors relating to mapping what is now Scotland and wider issues with his grid system. He places Thule at 63 degrees north, as opposed to the earlier presumed latitudes of around 66 degrees north for Strabo. However, Ptolemy's system is highly distorted. It likely places Thule somewhere in perhaps the Norwegian Sea, but refining this location further is difficult. There have been candidates suggested using adjusted forms of these coordinates, but it could refer to a large number of possible locations, from western Norway to the Scottish Northern Isles to the Faeroes. Our last classical author is Tacitus, a Roman historian writing towards the end of the 1st century AD, in his work Agricola, a biography of his father-in-law, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, a Roman general who was responsible for much of the conquest of Britain and campaigned deep into Scotland. He tells us this: "The Roman fleet, at this period, first sailing round this remotest coast, gave us certain proof that Britain was an island, and at the same time discovered and subdued the Orcades, islands till then unknown. Thule was also distantly seen, which winter and eternal snow had hitherto concealed." If this is to be taken at face value, it would suggest a location of Thule very close to Britain, and one that could be spotted by a Roman fleet sailing around the north coast of Scotland. This could suggest either a location in the Outer Hebrides, or more likely the Shetland Isles, perhaps particularly Fair Isle, which could be easily seen by a ship sailing around Orkney. However, we need to be careful here. We have relatively little reason to believe that the Thule Tacitus is referring to here is the same Thule as referenced by Pytheas. Tacitus is also far from unbiased here, and much of the work is spent trying to build up the prestige of his father-in-law. Within this, claiming a sighting of Thule, a place the Romans saw as the edge of the world, could be seen as a purposefully aggrandizing claim lacking in reliability. Now that we have read through our sources on the topic, let's try and set out some criteria for identifying Thule. Our available sources, as limited as they are, provide us with some useful data for attempting to identify Thule. Generally, the classical writers identify the following. Thule is north of Britain, possibly 6 days' travel north. During the summer in Thule, the sun does not set, or at least it does not experience total darkness, placing it within the Arctic or the subarctic regions. Our authors are consistent in describing what to them would have been extreme solar phenomena, but are not consistent in identifying the exact nature of that phenomena, whether it be very short nights during the summer and very long nights during winter, or the midnight sun and the polar night. That Thule is located near to the frozen or the slush sea. And finally, that it was agricultural and inhabited. Now, all of these criteria are up for debate given our limited sources, and we do not have enough information to solidify any of these points, but they do give us a start for identifying Thule. In the next chapter, we will identify the major possible candidates for Thule. Using the criteria we have established, we can examine our possible candidates. In our first section, we will examine Thule as a real, concrete location that Pytheas may have actually visited. Nordland is the southernmost Norwegian county within the Arctic Circle. While the other two Norwegian counties within the Arctic did not have meaningful agriculture at this time, nor connection to the Iron Age Northern European trade networks, Nordland did, with significant agricultural settlement and with trade and cultural connections, likely tying it into locations further south. While it is not located in an area that would frequently see a frozen sea, at least not without exceptional circumstances, it is located far enough north that, in line with Pliny, a viable voyage to the north may have encountered a frozen sea, although perhaps not in one day's travel. There are, however, some issues. Even assuming a journey from Shetland, the Norwegian Arctic is a minimum of a 900-kilometre journey, on the very edge of viability for the vessels of the time with the journey time given. A 1,100-kilometre journey from the Scottish mainland would have been even more unrealistic. Perhaps we could assume Pytheas is being accurate with his dates, or simply misremembering after the fact. He does potentially seem to do this in some other parts of his account, but it is still bordering on being non-viable due to distance alone. Perhaps if the journey to Nordland is beyond viability, a journey to somewhere further west in Norway might make more sense. This could be roughly anywhere on the Norwegian coast between Bergen and Trondheim. This is a much more plausible journey from Britain, especially one from the Scottish mainland, and can be made with relatively few easy island hops. However, in this western location, we do run into a few problems. While the summer nights are extremely long, they are not endless, and the sun does set for a few hours every night. This matches with our more conservative sources, like Mela and Geminus, but less so with Pliny and probably less so with Strabo. There is, however, a more significant issue, both with Western Norway and with Nordland, and that is the lack of obvious connections between Iron Age Scandinavia and Britain. While it is probable that the people on Shetland and Orkney were aware of the existence of Norway and vice versa, there is little evidence for frequent contact. Archaeologists have not identified evidence for any trade goods passing between the northern Scottish Isles and Norway, nor do we find genetic evidence for contact either among humans or domesticates. Although such evidence is highly limited, and it is possible that it is simply not extensive enough to detect occasional contact. This means that if Pytheas was travelling on existing trade networks, as I suspect he probably was, it is unlikely he would have been able to pay for passage to Norway. Of course, he could have hired a local navigator to take him, but that seems less likely given the significant distance and danger involved on the journey. Contact, to the extent that it likely existed, was probably rare and often accidental, rendering the chances of a voyage from the Northern Isles of Scotland to Norway much less likely. If we are to consider alternatives, the Faeroes seem like a reasonable start. The distance from the British mainland is approximately correct for a 6-day voyage, and it is around the same latitude as Western Norway, meaning that if we accept the summer twilight of Western Norway as a viable basis for the sort of descriptions of Thule we see in our classical sources, then the Faroe Islands might also be viable. The main problem with the Faroes is that there is no evidence for a substantial inhabited Iron Age farming society there in Pytheas' period, with no evidence for a consistent population prior to around the 4th century AD. While of course it is possible that something has been missed in the archaeology, there does not seem to be evidence for any significant Iron Age population as suggested in our fragments of Pytheas. The Shetland Isles lie around 180 kilometres north of the Scottish mainland, at a latitude roughly equivalent to Bergen in Norway. The Shetland Isles are an obvious candidate, since Tacitus's account of a sighting of Thule after Orkney is often taken to point in their direction. It was agricultural, with a significant population tied into the Scottish mainland through trade and likely kinship bonds. This makes it far more likely for Pytheas to be able to find passage to Shetland than to Norway or to the Faeroes. Shetland, though, does have a similar problem to western Norway and the Faroe Islands, in that Shetland does not have a true midnight sun, unlike what it described in Ptolemy. What it has is what the locals refer to as the simmer dim, where the day lasts for around 19 hours, and there is no true night, just a few hours of what is today referred to as civil twilight. This matches some, but not all, of our descriptions of Thule. Now, Shetland is possibly a little too close to the mainland for a 6-day journey, having here the opposite problem to somewhere like Nordland. A 180-kilometre journey would have been expected to take perhaps 3 days in a vessel of this time, although of course poor conditions or low winds could drag out this passage. However, we don't have to assume a journey originating from Dunnet Head or John O'Groats at the very far northeastern tip of Caithness. There are instead a number of other possible starting points where Pytheas could have sailed to the Shetlands in those 6 days. One obvious one would be further west on the Scottish mainland, perhaps sailing from around modern Durness. Alternatively, a voyage from the Hebrides is possible, say from Skye or probably more likely from Lewis. We also, of course, have the problem of the frozen sea showing up again, where Shetland is far too south to experience a frozen sea or be in any reasonable sailing distance to one. St Kilda might be the closest thing in the British Isles to a true edge-of-the-world experience. Unlike the Faeroes, it was inhabited and it was agricultural. It was tied into the wider patterns of the pre-Roman Iron Age British life. It should also not be dismissed too quickly on grounds of direction alone. A voyage to St Kilda could have still been experienced and described as a journey into the far north, depending on where Pytheas began his crossing and how he conceived of the geography of Britain's outer fringes. Even so, there are real problems. St Kilda lies to the west of the Hebrides, rather than clearly beyond northern Britain. It is too far south to fit the stronger astronomical or frozen sea descriptions, and it is perhaps rather too easy to fold into a wider circumnavigation of Britain, rather than to identify as a clearly separate and extraordinary destination. For those reasons, St Kilda remains interesting, but is probably not one of our strongest candidates. In a similar way to St Kilda, he could also have visited the Hebrides. This is an attractive possibility, as we can be relatively sure that he would have had to have visited them during his circumnavigation of Britain, and as such we don't have to invent extra routes for him to travel. And of course the Hebrides were already very heavily tied in to Iron Age trading routes, making it easy for him to find passage there. A similar argument could of course also apply to Orkney. However, the Hebrides and Orkney have a lot of the same problems. They are too far south in most of the descriptions, and they are not clearly distinct from a circumnavigation of Britain. They are also, of course, nowhere near an ice sea. One popular theory is that Thule was Iceland. Iceland would explain the midnight sun, fitting with the more maximalist interpretations of the solar phenomena reported from Thule, even if technically the island falls just south of the true Arctic Circle. Iceland would also fit well with the idea of Thule sitting just south of an ice sea, and it is really the only location we have discussed that truly explains that. However, there are some pretty significant problems. We have very limited evidence of any population on Iceland before the Norse settlement in the 9th century. There may have been some Irish monks who who settled there in perhaps extremely limited numbers, with non-self-sustaining communities prior to the Norse, and perhaps as early as the 6th century AD. But we have absolutely no evidence for any kind of population as early as the 4th century BC, let alone a relatively expansive agricultural society, as Pytheas appears to suggest. I think it is pretty reasonable to assume that Iceland was simply not part of the known world of the Northern European societies in the 4th century BC. Then there is the issue of distance. A journey to Iceland would have been over 800 kilometres, even from the closest reasonable starting point on the Isle of Lewis, and over significantly more dangerous waters than the voyage to Norway. The viability of this journey, both in terms of distance and the danger of an open ocean crossing of the North Atlantic, makes this destination extremely doubtful. Various other candidates have been proposed. From Greenland to Saaremaa in Estonia, these candidates generally have the same sort of problems. Either they are far too remote to be reasonably considered, were completely uninhabited and unvisited during the relevant time period, were completely disconnected for the relevant trade networks, or simply fit none of the viable criteria. Now that we've examined the candidates for Thule as a real physical location that Pytheas may have actually visited, we need to consider a second possibility. That Thule was not somewhere that Pytheas reached in person at all, but rather a place he heard about from others and incorporated into his account. This possibility helps explain one of the central problems in the evidence. From what little survives of Pytheas' journey, his descriptions of Britain appear to contain a meaningful core of real observation. Thule, by contrast, is much harder to pin down. Its reported features just do not sit comfortably together. On the one hand, it seems to lie at or near the Arctic Circle, close to the frozen sea, and is associated with the strange solar phenomena of the far north. On the other hand, it is described as inhabited, agricultural, socially organised, and only 6 days' journey from Britain. No single candidate fits all of these features especially well. That makes more sense if Thule was not a single observed place, but a synthesized account built out of second-hand reports and possibly some of Pytheas' own observations. If Pytheas had reached places like Orkney or Shetland, he may have encountered people who at least had some knowledge of lands further north and east, particularly Norway. But if contact was only occasional, then that knowledge may have been partial, imprecise, or filtered through rumour, folklore, and storytelling, rather than direct familiarity. Under that interpretation, the contradictions in the account become easier to understand. The agricultural and settled elements could reflect real knowledge of Western Norway, extending upwards into regions like Nordland. The reports of the midnight sun might point further north still, towards the Arctic Circle. The frozen sea belongs further north still. Rather than describing one single place, the account may be collapsing several different northern realities into one. This might also explain why the surviving descriptions of Thule feel so elusive. They preserve striking and memorable details, but not the kind of precise, grounded description that we might expect from direct observation. What we may be seeing is Pytheas taking fragments of genuine knowledge and reshaping them into a single far northern land at the edge of the known world. In that sense, Thule may be best understood not as a point on a map, but as a composite frontier, an idea formed from real geography, the tendency of distant places to blur together in the imagination, and in perfect transmission, both from Pytheas' own sources to him, and then from Pytheas to the classical writers who have preserved his account. Alternatively, there is a third possibility, that Thule was, at least in part, a fabrication. Strabo seems to treat Pytheas in exactly that spirit. He presents him as an unreliable source, and repeatedly accuses him of falsehood, hearsay, and implausible claims. This possibility has genuine explanatory force. If no single location fits the describing locations of Thule particularly well, and if those descriptions seem to combine features that do not comfortably belong together, then we have to allow for the real chance that we are not dealing with misunderstood geography and hearsay alone, but with geography that was already partially legendary by the time it reached the Mediterranean world, including possibly with Pytheas' own fabrications built on top of that. In that case, the problem is not that we have failed to identify the right island or landmass, but that no real place ever truly existed. I would still not make this the default explanation. Pytheas seems to have transmitted genuine information about Britain and the northern seas, and later ancient authors continued to use him despite their doubts. But as a possibility, at least partial fabrication cannot be dismissed. Indeed, it may explain the vagueness and contradictions of Thule more easily than some of the more ambitious attempts to pin it in one exact place. So then, what was Thule? In the end, I don't think I can give you any one single confident explanation. I think probably the strongest explanation was that Thule was at least partially a synthesized account. Not a pure invention, but not a simple description of one observed location either. This would best explain why the surviving reports combine features that don't make sense in one single place. An inhabited agricultural society, a midnight sun, and a proximity to the frozen sea. This could be a combination of the places and events that Pytheas himself experienced, such as the extremely long summer nights of the Orkney and Shetland Isles, the Har, and the bad weather of the North Atlantic, combined with folklore and incomplete stories about the lands that lay even further north. That being said, I would also not completely dismiss the possibility that there was a real place behind the story. Locations such as Shetland, Western Norway, and even Nordland remain plausible in different ways, even if none fit every part of the evidence comfortably. If I was to venture out on a limb, I would suggest probably somewhere in Nordland, being the single most likely explanation that fits best with all of the evidence, even if it is quite far away from any British starting point for the journey. What I find least likely is that Thule was simply invented from nothing. Pytheas, for all of his problems, seems to preserve plenty of genuine information about Britain and the North Atlantic. And if his account of Thule became distorted, it seems more likely that this happened through rumour, exaggeration, and the blending of second-hand reports that most of our sources seem to rely on, rather than outright fabrication. But those are my thoughts. So where do you stand on this? Please give me your opinion in the comments section. Alternatively, if you have spotted any errors that have crept in here, please do point them out. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this dive into the mysterious land of Thule.